So welcome everybody. This is going to be our Remembrance Day webinar for this year. Hopefully a few of you have been able to get out to some of the Remembrance Day ceremonies in the region. I know I went to Beamsville this year and found that I've been every year for the past probably 5 years. And even though it looked like it was going to rain, I think this was the biggest crowd that I've seen for quite some time. So I think the interest definitely is there. And given the number of people who have joined us this evening, that there's a lot of people who are interested, especially in the First World War. And as a result, tonight we have Eric Story here to discuss how the medical war unfolded from 1914 to 1918 through one of the gravest diseases in the 20th century, tuberculosis. It was called the Great White Plague, and it caused intense fears of not only death, but also long-term chronic illness. So Eric's going to discuss a lot of that stuff and how that forced the Canadian government to rethink how they approached healthcare. Eric is an AMS postdoctoral researcher at Brock University. He's a historian of war, colonialism, medicine, and disability. Welcome, Eric. Before I let you start, I'm going to again point out that we've got a few nice webinars coming up starting in January and February. In January, Nadia Rupanik is going to join us and talk about her family's research into World War II. In February, Graham Seger from the Pelham Historical Society is going to talk to us about Terrain's map establishment. So stay tuned for those. You have joined us before, you're familiar with our format, so I'm going to ask you to hold or enter any questions that you have while Eric is talking, and I'll hold them all to the end so that we can ask Eric your questions all together. All right. How are you doing, Eric?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to speaking to everybody tonight about some of the work that I've been doing, and then also to hear from you folks about the things that you're interested in and things that crop up in your mind as I go through my presentation. It's going to be fun. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in on a Friday evening. I know that this is a great crowd to speak to because you're coming out on a Friday night, which means history is something you'd want to do on the weekends, which is not the case for everyone. I thought I'd start today with a poem that might sound familiar, but most of you, if not all of you, probably will never have heard it before, even if it does sound somewhat familiar. In Flanders fields, we do not lie, where poppies grow and larks will fly, forever singing as they go, above the bodies, row on row, of those whose duty was to die. We are the maimed, death did deny, its solace, crippled blind we try, to find on earth the peace they know, in Flanders fields. Forget us not, as years go by, on your remembrance we rely, for love that sees the hearts below, to crave our bodies with those who lie in Flanders fields. Now that's a poem. It was published in the early 1920s by someone named W.B. France. It probably was a pen name. It was published in an American magazine. And of course, it's a rendition of In Flanders Fields by John McCrae, but instead of focusing on the dead, it focuses on the disabled, those who fought in the First World War but did not fall. They survived and lived on with the wounds that they had sustained on the battlefield. And that is, in large part, what I'm going to be focusing upon today. Perhaps not through a traditional war wound like an amputation or a lost eye, but instead by looking at one of the greatest, most dreaded diseases of the 20th century, as Amanda noted, tuberculosis. Now, many of you in this Zoom meeting are probably very familiar with the Great War. I don't need to tell you too much about it. There we go. You've probably heard of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June of 1914, which eventually led Great Britain to declare war on Germany on the 4th of August. You probably also know that Canada was automatically at war that same day when Great Britain declared war on Germany. Many of you will know the names of famous French and Belgian cities and towns, including Ypres, Passchendaele, Amiens, and Arras, because these were the names of the famous battles where Canadians fought during the Great War. Of course, you'll know Vimy Ridge, but I'd hazard a guess that fewer of you will know of the disease colloquially known at the turn of the 20th century as the White Plague, or as we know today, tuberculosis. And tonight, what I'm going to share with you is the story of tuberculosis during the Great War and its aftermath, to tell you how a tiny bacterium the size of something smaller than a grain of sand forced the Canadian government to reconsider how it approached the health care of all Canadians, as well as how it ravaged the bodies of soldiers well beyond the battlefields into post-war life, building off of that poem by W.B. France, We Are the Maimed. Now, before I get into the historical context, we should know a little bit about the science of tuberculosis. So tuberculosis, to be clear, is an infectious disease. It's caused by a tiny bacterium called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Tuberculosis bacteria are spread, much like COVID is, through airborne droplets or aerosols that are expelled when coughing, sneezing, singing, or even just simply breathing. And when these bacteria are breathed into or inhaled into the body, they tend to settle in the lungs and cause damage to that organ in particular, but they also can settle in different parts of the body and cause damage to different parts of the body than just the lungs. The common symptoms of tuberculosis are cough, fever, and fatigue. The weight loss, night sweats, and chest pain are also typical. And these symptoms, in many ways, they resemble a typical cold or a flu. And so those living in the 20th century often mistaked tuberculosis for more common sicknesses and illnesses. But once they began to lose weight, and especially once they began to exhibit the most kind of feared and dreaded symptom of all, which is coughing up blood, that's often when they would consult a doctor, when they first began to realize that maybe they have something more than just a cold or a flu. So in the early 20th century, now moving into the history itself, tuberculosis was the most common killer of Canadians. Just as a brief comparison, the mortality rate of COVID-19 at the height of the pandemic in 2021 in Ontario was nearly 60 deaths per 100,000 people in the province. Compare that to tuberculosis in 1901, which had a mortality rate of more than 160 deaths per 100,000 Ontarians. And so it's, of course, important to acknowledge that today and the early 20th century are very different periods, as many of you who have done historical research know, in that mortality rates generally are higher in the early 20th century than they are today. But nonetheless, tuberculosis is a feared and fearsome disease that killed 2.5 times more Ontarians in 1901 than COVID did in 2021. In response to the annual devastation that tuberculosis met on the population, not only in Ontario, but across Canada, doctors, philanthropists, and politicians came together, again, in the early 20th century to fight the disease. And at the forefront of that fight was the building of tuberculosis hospitals called sanatoria to house patients diagnosed with the disease. This was the crowning achievement of what was called the anti-tuberculosis campaign or crusade. The purpose of these facilities was not only to isolate the sick from the healthy, but it was also to provide very specific institutional care under the supervision of medical specialists who had been studying the disease for many years by this point. And many of the doctors and nurses that staffed those institutions had tuberculosis themselves in a previous part of their lives. So in 1897, the first sanatorium was built. Some of you may know this. It was built in Gravenhurst, Ontario. It was called the Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium, and it opened its doors to 33 patients. That was the first sanatorium. But by 1914, you actually have the growth of as many as 38 sanatoria across the country, which included 1,200 beds for patients. Now, my local connection for this talk is the sanatorium that was built in the Niagara region, and that was the St. Catharines Consumptive Sanatorium, which was built in 1909. It was built on Collier, if anyone knows St. Catharines, it was built on Collier Hill, which is just north of the St. Catharines Golf and Country Club today. And it remained there for a number of years. Eventually, they actually moved buildings to Glenridge Avenue in the 1920s or 30s. I'm not exactly sure when, and it was renamed the Niagara Peninsula Sanatorium. But by the eve of the First World War, they were still at Collier Hill, and the institution was called the St. Catharines Consumptive Sanatorium. Now, St. Catharines Sanatorium was smaller than most sanatoria would have been at this time. It housed up to 20 patients, and also in contrast to what most sanatoria did, the St. Catharines Consumptive Sanatorium tended to care for the most sick and the most destitute in the Niagara region. So these patients that were basically had absolutely no money left, all institutional care was free, and many of these patients were virtually on their deathbed. So it was quite a gloomy, mortality-ridden institution. But that was where patients from the Niagara region would have come if they were very sick and they had no other options before them. Now, this sanatorium in St. Catharines, it did not take any military patients during the Great War. There may have been patients that came, veterans patients that came afterwards, but during the war, they did not house any military patients. But nonetheless, St. Catharines Consumptive Sanatorium was a part of the system of institutional care for tuberculosis patients in the years leading up to the Great War. Now, when Canada finally did go to war in 1914, very few were thinking about tuberculosis. Instead, Canadians were focused on mobilizing an army, an expeditionary force, which Sir Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia and Defense at the time, promised would be 25,000 men strong. And ultimately, he was successful. He achieved his goal of mobilizing not just 25,000 men, but 32,000 men in total. And they amassed at Valcartier Camp in November of 1914 for training near Quebec City. And they trained there for a couple of months until January 1915, when the first contingent of Canadians set sails for England, and they landed on the infamous Salisbury Plains. And they did so in one of the wettest winters that England had seen in many decades. And of the 124 days that this first contingent spent training at Salisbury Plains, it rained for 89. So it was a sloppy, mucky, muddy environment that these men trained in. And you can see that in the photo on the screen in front of you. One soldier wrote of the conditions, this is a quote from him, "It rains here every day and all day, and my bed seems about the only dry place. The mud in places, especially on the roads, is about halfway up your shins," again, as this photo shows, "and it still rains. Beyond it being disagreeable, we are all very uncomfortable." Because of these kind of wet, muddy, and cold conditions, men began to huddle together in makeshift huts and in tents in order to stay warm. And that effectively turned Salisbury Plains into a breeding ground, a festering place for disease. One private of the 11th Battalion wrote back home to his mother, quote, "We have quite a few cases of sickness in camp here and a whole lot of dying every week through different diseases. I hope anyway that I'll get through it. I'd rather get a bullet in my brain than die here in the mud," end quote. Doctors would later attribute many tuberculous soldiers' disease to these awful conditions of that place, even if they didn't necessarily immediately fall ill with tuberculosis at Salisbury Plains itself. So in February, the first contingent departed Salisbury Plains and they arrived on the Western Front for the first time. In April, they were sent into the Ypres salient, and it was there where they engaged the German army for the first time in what's been known as Canada's baptism of fire at the Second Battle of Ypres. On the 22nd of April, the Germans released 160 tons of chlorine gas on the Canadians' left flank. And that kind of yellow quadrant on your screen in the top left-hand corner, that is where the gas largely was concentrated. And the result of that was the fleeing of the French and Algerian divisions that were concentrated on that part of the line south in fear of this kind of greenish yellow cloud that was causing them to cough and choke and suffocate in the liquid that was building in their lungs. And so this opened up essentially a 6-kilometer long gap on the Canadians' left flank. So you can see the first Canadian division, where that red line begins, right where that green line ends on the kind of top of the map. And so as a result, the collapse of the French and Algerian divisions meant that the Germans were allowed to proceed south, which opened up the Canadians on the left side of the 1st Canadian Division to attack on 2 fronts, one at the front and then one on their left flank. And one particular private, Oliver Eastwood, he fought with the 13th Battalion, which was caught right on that left flank of the 1st Canadian Division. He watched in horror as Germans to his left began to march, take position, and then fire upon him and his comrades, while at the same time the Germans directly in front of them began to do the same. During this firefight, Private Eastwood, he was shot through the leg, the shoulder, and the arm, but he was also gassed, which brought on a cough, expectoration, little bits and pieces in his spit as he began to cough, and a great deal of difficulty breathing. Though his gunshot wounds to his arm, shoulder, and leg healed, his cough persisted, and he was soon after transferred to the Pinewood Sanatorium in England as a tuberculosis patient. Private Eastwood was one of the first Canadians diagnosed with tuberculosis during the First World War. But how did Private Eastwood get there? How did he get to England? Because he was first wounded and gassed in Belgium. So how did Private Eastwood move from the front lines all the way across the English Channel to England for treatment? In order to arrive at an English medical facility, Private Eastwood and other soldiers who not only fell ill with tuberculosis or respiratory illness, but also wounds, they had to move through what was called the casualty management system, which began at the regimental aid post, where the regimental medical officer, basically the doctor that was responsible for the health of frontline troops, was situated. And if the regimental medical officer believed that the soldier was sick enough to be moved back from the front lines, he would move the soldier from the regimental aid post to the field ambulance, which then could lead to the casualty clearing station, and then finally arriving at the general hospital, right on the coastline of France. And that would usually take anywhere from 12 to 72 hours for soldiers, again, sick, ill, or wounded, to arrive there. And once they arrived at the general hospital, that was when soldiers, if they were suspected to be tuberculosis sufferers, they were tested for the disease. And their sputum specimens, or specimens coming from their spit, were examined under a microscope to determine if the tuberculosis bacterium was there. And if they were found to have the tuberculosis bacterium in their sputum, they were then shipped over, or through across the English Channel, I should say, from France into England, and eventually where they arrived at the Pinewood Sanatorium. Now, by the end of August 1915, so this is really only the first year of the war, there were 26 Canadian troops taking treatment at the Pinewood Sanatorium. And these soldiers, while taking treatment at the Pinewood Sanatorium, were very poorly behaved, to the chagrin of the staff that was working there. Now, there are a number of reasons why these soldiers were so poorly behaved while taking treatment at the Pinewood Sanatorium, which I don't have time to go through in detail, but one of the main factors of their misbehavior, their widespread misbehavior, is that at this point they were caught between military and civilian life. When they signed up to fight for the Canadian Expeditionary Force, they signed a contract, and in that contract, they wanted to fight. They wanted to participate in battle. But once they were diagnosed with tuberculosis and they were sent to a sanatorium, their doctors told them that their fighting days were done. They would never return to the front lines. And from there, those soldiers believed that they had made up their end of the contract. They had done all they could to fight until they had broken down and become ill. And they saw no reason why they needed to remain in treatment and to remain as part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force if they were no longer a part of the fighting force. So really, all these soldiers wanted to do was go home. And because they weren't allowed, that's why they were so poorly behaved. Some of that behavior being chasing after women, getting drunk at bars, staying out past curfew, irritating the civilian patients who were also taking treatment there. That was some of the examples of the things that they would do. But this is the major problem. Oops, I won't get there yet. One of the major problems that Pinewood Sanatorium faced with these soldiers is that by the end of September, there were no beds left to house these tuberculous soldiers from Canada. And so the medical superintendent of the Pinewood Sanatorium, he made a decision. He decided that the soldiers who were taking treatment there would either remain in treatment if they were terribly ill, but if they were stable enough, he would ship them back home to Canada because he needed to make room for more soldiers that would be coming, especially as the Canadian Expeditionary Force began to grow in size. And this seemingly small and relatively inconsequential decision, it makes sense. The doctors had to make triage decisions in times of war. It would trigger effectively a crisis on the home front in Canada. Remember those 38 sanatoria that had been erected across Canada in the years leading up to the Great War? Doctors and directors of the various health associations responsible for these sanatoria, they had been complaining for years that there was not enough money and not enough capacity to admit all of the patients that they wanted to these sanatoria. They had been complaining again for years of long waiting lists that were never alleviated. They were just constantly added to year after year. Here's what the president of the Hamilton Health Association said in 1914, in the same month of the war. He said, "The number of names on our waiting lists of patients shows the urgent need for accommodation. Even with the expansion of our infirmary, we cannot meet growing demand." When Canadian troops diagnosed with tuberculosis were sent home for the first time in 1915 for further treatment, there were actually only 52 beds out of the 1,200 in total empty and open for patients to be admitted into. And so for about a year, medical superintendents and doctors did their best to accommodate these soldiers with the beds that they had at their disposal. They added, ramshackle, improvised kind of tents and spaces to house these soldiers as best they could. But in the summer of 1916, a full-blown crisis in institutional capacity erupted. There was just simply no room left for these soldiers. Even though returned soldiers were supposed to be admitted to sanatoria from the military districts in which they enlisted, soldiers who enlisted in Eastern Canada and Atlantic Canada were oftentimes shipped as far as Manitoba because there was just simply no bed space in Atlantic Canada for them. In one particularly alarming episode, a group of tuberculous soldiers ended up at Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium, that first sanatorium that was built in Canada in 1897, and there was not enough room for all of them. And so while some were accommodated, the rest were actually sent back out into the streets. and several ended up wandering throughout the city, unhoused, sick, packing up a lung, and they didn't have a roof over their heads. Reports of these unhoused and infectious veterans soon made their way into the press, and the government then realized that it had a potential crisis in confidence on its hands. If it did not respond, it not only risked infecting those kind of civilians back home in Canada with tuberculosis. More consequentially, though, at least for the government of Robert Borden, it risked breaking the oath it had made the previous year of providing care for disabled veterans. It made a promise, and within a year, it was on the brink of not being able to carry out or make good on those promises that it had made. Breaking that oath threatened recruitment, because potential recruits might think twice if they know that they might fall into destitution as a result of war disability and no accompanying support from the state. Yet it also might cripple the overall war effort if the population at large lost confidence in the government of upholding its own responsibilities of prosecuting the war effort. And so, recognizing this potentially catastrophic situation, the government poured millions and millions of dollars into building sanatoria across the country. It upgraded pre-existing institutions into truly modern medical facilities with X-ray machines and laboratories for analysis. And they built new ones from the ground up along those same lines. And by 1917, the government had effectively averted the tuberculosis crisis of the previous year. And it was just in the nick of time, as only 3,000 veterans had taken treatment to that point in 1917. By 1921, more than 10,000 veterans in total would take treatment for tuberculosis. So that scaling of infrastructure was dearly needed if the government was going to be able to carry out, or again, abide by the promises it had made to its population. So by the end of the war, the federal government had invested $3.5 million into sanatoria in Canada, which represented some of the earliest instances of direct federal investment and intervention into institutional healthcare in Canadian history. Before the war, healthcare was largely seen as the responsibility of the provinces, but the tuberculosis crisis of 1916 forced the hand of the federal government to directly involve itself in the everyday health of Canadians. And so though we often think of federal healthcare and discussions of it happening in the 40s and then materializing in the 1950s, we can see examples of it during the Great War, which laid the groundwork for federally subsidized healthcare several decades later. But that's the story of how the government involved itself and how doctors managed the tuberculosis crisis during the Great War. But what was life like in these sanatoria for returning veterans? Well, the defining feature of these institutions, I would argue anyways, was boredom. Patient life was dreadfully repetitive, as you can see by the schedule outlined on the screen in front of you. Much of the day was spent resting, either in bed or outdoors in a reclining chair. Patients exhibiting symptoms of tuberculosis had even more restrictive routines than the ones outlined on your screen. Aside from going to the washroom, they were essentially instructed to rest at all times in the day, except for going to the washroom. And so it was a dreadfully tedious and boring existence in sanatorium. And so in response, what veterans did is they groused and they griped and they grumbled. They griped about their food, they griped about their doctors and their nurses, and especially of the dreariness of their everyday lives. But it's important to remember that even though they griped and they groused, it did not necessarily represent a complete disillusionment with their doctors or even sanatorium life at large. As you can read by this quote on the screen, the editor of a sanatorium newspaper, which patients read, often daily, there are at times, it is true in the experience, even of the most cheerful, when a good grouch is not merely excusable, but even beneficial as tending to clear the mental atmosphere. And so griping essentially allowed veterans to blow off steam, right? And it allowed them to carry on with treatment. More than just griping, though, humor and poking fun at the tedium of sanatorium treatment became an effective outlet for them. I just want to tell you one kind of short anecdote, again, published in the sanatorium newspapers, but it gives some insight into how these soldiers or veterans made this dreary existence humorous. So here's a fictional interaction between a doctor and a patient. The patient says, "I have been in a sanatorium for 11 years and do not seem to get any better. Is it worthwhile staying any longer?" The doctor replies, "Certainly. You must stay quite a while before you are cured. Keep thinking of something pleasant." Now, of course, patients' time in sanatorium was not 11 years. On average, it was anywhere from 6 to 9 months at most. But the humor here lies in the warped perception of time and the common experience of an unsympathetic doctor's poor bedside manner that these veterans are making fun of. And so this kind of poking fun at and making comedy or making comedic parts of life that are particularly dreary, and in this particular case, quite gruesome, it extended to discussions of death. So it was not uncommon for people to die in sanatoria. At the Queen Alexandra Sanatorium in Kingston between 1918 and 1919, 16 veterans alone died in a patient population no greater than 300. And so death was ubiquitous. It was constantly among them. But veterans learned to mock its prospect and contributions, again, to their local sanatorium newspapers. And so you can see, again, pictured on your screen, the poem on the left was a common trench song that soldiers sang while they were fighting in the trenches. And in the sanatorium newspaper in Nova Scotia, patients adapted it to fit the institutional environment of the Nova Scotia Sanatorium. And this poem read, "Far, far from Kentville I want to be, where TB doctors can't pick on me. Hard are our rest chairs, high is my bed. Of times I wonder why we're not dead." This kind of ability to mock death was a common trope that soldiers embraced during the Great War. Mocking death was a part of the gallows humor of the trenches. And in the sanatorium, they drew from a very similar vernacular or language to resist the specter of death that continued to loom over their lives while they were taking treatment there. They may not have been able to predict when or how they might die, though they certainly thought it was tuberculosis. At least they could make fun of it and choose to laugh at its prospect. And so they had very little control in this institutional environment, but they could at least have control and choose to laugh at things they wanted to. Another kind of important part, less important than occupational therapy, that soldiers or veterans took part in beginning in 1916 and throughout the war and afterwards. So depending upon one's medical status, veterans would do embroidering, such as this young man here. Others might take up carpentry. It really depended on the status of the soldier's health, and it helped them pass time. But not all were necessarily keen to participate in occupational therapy. And consequently, one's willingness to adopt occupational therapy into their daily routines actually allowed tuberculous veterans to sort their fellow sufferers into what I call good-hearted grumblers on one hand and pessimistic complainers on the other. Now, you might be thinking, Eric, you just said that these soldiers, they griped, they groused, they complained all the time. And you're right, they did. And to the casual observer, this distinction between grumbling on one hand and complaining on the other would not be very apparent. But to those who were taking treatment in sanatorium, the line was very clear. They know exactly who were the grousers and who were the complainers. And that's best exemplified by this cartoon, which again was published in these newspapers. So you can see on the left, the optimist. He is participating in occupational therapy, building a basket of some sort, perhaps might be used by a child representing the future generation. So he's preparing to integrate into civilian society once he has left the sanatorium. The pessimist, on the other hand, he just refuses to participate in it whatsoever, despite the poster in the background saying that Canada needs her returned soldiers in the project of reconstruction. And so occupational therapy effectively helped establish the parameters and membership of what I call a sanatorium culture. And anyone who sat on the outside of those parameters was not privy to that culture. Now, all of these kind of components of sanatorium living, which included shared humor, shared experiences, shared history, and even a shared language in the sanatorium, sustained morale and brought tuberculosis veterans close together in a common bond of suffering. And it was through this common bond of suffering that arose a political activism amongst tuberculosis veterans, which led to the creation of a group called the Tuberculosis Veterans Association in 1918. Now, much of the focus of the Tuberculosis Veterans Association in the early years was around pensions, but by 1920, they had shifted focus ever so slightly to the issue of tuberculosis disability. Even though amputations represent only about 5% of all disabled veterans after the war, the image of a veteran with a sling, of a missing leg, or even a bandaged head over one's eye, they came to represent the quote-unquote authentic veteran after the war. And you can see that in these posters, right? All of these posters that were produced by the government, they indicate soldiers with some visible form of wounding. And this singular vision of visible wounding was articulated again and again in homecoming parades, state propaganda such as these posters, and in imperial exhibitions around the world. These wounds, they were clear to the naked eye. And so people looking at these soldiers could very much recognize that they were disabled as a result of the war. Tuberculosis veterans did not have that same luxury because their wounds were internal. They were non-visible. And they very much regretted the kind of lack of knowledge and awareness of war tuberculosis that they had suffered from. And so they set out to make sure that tuberculosis veterans and those suffering from tuberculosis would get the recognition that they felt they deserved. And so they pushed for the establishment of self-segregated colonies, a phenomenal and fascinating little experiment that they pursued from 1920 to 1925. As part of these colonies, they asked for the institution of a basic minimum income scheme funded by the federal government, so men could tailor the number of hours they worked to their disability. And so basically what these tuberculosis veterans are doing, they're looking at very specific and targeted interventions to alleviate the suffering or address the challenges that arise from that suffering as a result of tuberculosis being a chronic disease. Now, these colonies, the idea of a colony, ultimately failed, but their biggest achievement arrived in 1926. Delegation after delegation from the Tuberculosis Veterans Association appeared before the House of Commons in many special committee hearings. And they asked in those special committee hearings for a basic minimum pension, or a guaranteed minimum pension, I should say. And each year, the special committees would ultimately not recommend a guaranteed minimum pension because they argued that they could not make special concessions to particular groups of disabled veterans. But in 1926, the Tuberculosis Veterans Association was ultimately successful. After a royal commission looking into pensions in 1925, the federal government decided to automatically award a 100% pension, a full disability pension, for 1 full year after discharge to all tuberculosis veterans who took treatment at a sanatorium, and guaranteed after that a minimum pension of 50% for the remainder of their lives, I should say. And so the tireless work of these men effectively pushed the boundaries of Canada's emerging welfare state in the 1920s by insisting that their challenges required special provision in order to help them live and ultimately survive day to day. They played a direct role in shaping the extent of our current social security net that we have in Canada today. Now, I'm going to wrap things up tonight with the story of a veteran who lived until 1956 with chronic tuberculosis. His name was Gunner William Bach. He first coughed up blood as part of the 34th Battery of the Canadian Expeditionary Force while serving along the Western Front in 1917, and he was soon after diagnosed with tuberculosis. He spent about a month in sanatorium in England and then was transferred to the Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium in Canada. Again, that first sanatorium ever established in the country, for 7 more months of treatment. After discharge, he applied for job training that the federal government provided for disabled veterans, and he actually took up a course in filmmaking and ended up in Hollywood, training as a quote-unquote moving picture film operator. He thought he had a glorious career ahead of him. But ongoing symptoms of tuberculosis made this type of work impossible, and he eventually quit. He left Hollywood and returned home to Canada to rest and recover from his disease. After about 2 years, he finally felt some reprieve from his symptoms, and that reprieve lasted for the better part of 8 years, until 1930, during the Great Depression, when he began to experience symptoms on and off once again. In 1936, he finally relapsed completely. He collapsed in England. He hurriedly returned home to Canada with the help of some family and friends, and when he arrived at the Queen Alexandra Sanatorium in Kingston, and he was wheeled into the X-ray room, doctors discovered a massive gaping hole over his left lung. After a brief consultation, Bach underwent surgery to remove several of his own ribs so that his lung could be put to rest. Surgery was ultimately successful, but after he had recovered from the surgery, he went back in for another round of X-ray imaging to see if that lung was properly stabilized. And they found something even worse. He had tuberculosis of the spine. There's only one course of action to treat tuberculosis of the spine, and that was a complete body cast from the chest all the way down to his knees. And after the casting set, he was immobilized at the Queen Alexandra Sanatorium for 3 full years, where he remained in bed for that entire time. But he survived. He survived this harrowing ordeal, and he was proud of it. He talked often of how doctors told him that his was the worst case of spinal tuberculosis they had ever seen, and that he would never live to see beyond the surgery for bone tuberculosis. But he did. He survived. But tuberculosis of the spine, of the bone, took its toll on William Bach's body till his dying days. He had a spinal fusion in the 1940s, and until 1956, when he died, he walked with a cane and a back brace, which were potent symbols of the surgery and the bone tuberculosis that he suffered, but also a potent reminder that this was a war disability. Now, I tell you the story of William Bach and others like him, not to evoke the suffering and horror of tuberculosis, but to remind you that veterans' wartime experiences were not contained to the battlefields. Soldiers certainly fought enemy combatants, but they also fought long, protracted battles with their wounds and illnesses upon returning home from war. Bach's story is also a potent reminder that disability does not necessarily have to be visible in order to be a legitimate war wound. For much of his adult life, Bach fought a largely invisible illness. And even when he began to walk with a cane, stooped shoulders, and a hunched back, very few would have known that his disabled body was very much the result of a disease he incurred while fighting on the battlefields of the Great War.
Thank you so much, Eric. Oh, what a fascinating story, and your photographs are just incredible. It clearly took a lot of research for you to get all of this stuff together.
Yeah.
Where did you find, like, uh, I know that a lot of our people are interested in specific records. Find the specific records that you were looking at.
Yeah, so I'd say a combination of three sets of records were my primary resources for this project. I'm sure many of those that are on this Zoom meeting tonight are familiar with the personnel records of the First World War, which are held by Library and Archives Canada. An excellent resource, again, as many of you have kind of understanding the kind of medical problems of the First World War and the individual experiences of soldiers either wounded or ill. So those were particularly key for me. That's source base number one. Source base number two, I mentioned them several times, but sanatorium newspapers. They were published, actually, they were founded and published right when veterans started to arrive at sanatorium in 1918, 1919, and 1920. And there very much were, in most cases, the result of veterans wanting to put together their own publications to start to understand their experiences together in a community, but also to spread awareness about tuberculosis as a disease, how people could prevent against it, but also the kind of long-term challenges of tuberculosis as a chronic disease. Those are the issues they were hoping to raise a public profile around. So that's source base number two. And then the third source base that I'm pretty sure most folks don't know about. The Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada, about 10 years ago now, began a massive digitization project of the pension records of the First World War. And there are 203,000 files, individual files in total. The project is now finished and has been transferred to Charlottetown with Veterans Affairs Canada, who initially held these records. For anybody who is interested in an ancestor's war service record, there very well might be an accompanying pension file. And these files extend beyond the war. The service records start as early as 14 and go as late as 19, but the pension files can start as early as 1915 and can go as late as the 1950s. They cover disability pension percentages that the state's assigning them, but they also cover medical reports because they're having to go into doctors regularly to demonstrate whether their disability had improved or declined or got worse, which then would lead to a decision on how much money they would receive from the government. In addition to that, you get home visits from social service records, sometimes letters from veterans themselves complaining about their ailments or low pension disbursements and things like that. They are another just very rich source that is not very well known. So yeah, if anyone has questions about those pension files, I'm happy to answer more questions about them, but I can also direct you to where you can go to request them.
Oh, very interesting. So are they online, the pension records? Or are they?
No, they're not online. So they're in digital form. So they've been all turned into, they were initially microfilm reels. There was, I think, 1,500 reels that we digitized at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. And then from there took the raw images and packaged them into individual veteran pension records. And then once that project was finished, we shared the database with Veterans Affairs Canada, who ultimately holds ownership over them. And so now they're responsible for distributing them to interested members of the Canadian public.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a few questions already lined up. Eileen and Carolyn are both interested in gas. Eileen wanted to know if chlorine gas contributed to getting TB, and Carolyn wanted to know if it was common for soldiers who had been gassed to contract TB.
Yeah, so it's a tricky question because in the early 20th century, by about 1910, almost all doctors at the time believed that tuberculosis as a disease was ubiquitous across Canadian society, and that everybody had tuberculosis or had been infected with tuberculosis.
Mm.
And basically, what that meant was that everybody had been infected, but not necessarily everybody was going to exhibit symptoms of tuberculosis. In fact, you can actually live your entire life with a tuberculosis infection and never exhibit symptoms. So tuberculosis is very much a kind of disease of poverty. And so when people are living in poor living or living in rundown houses with poor ventilation, they're not getting good nutrition, they're not getting good rests at night. Those are contributing factors that will then lead to an activation of a tuberculosis infection into active manifestation of symptoms, right? And so the thing is during the First World War, gas probably didn't cause tuberculosis, but it probably aggravated a previous tuberculosis infection that was already there, right? And so, in addition to that, soldiers, of course, are also living in pretty awful environmental conditions, right? They're living in the mud, they're freezing cold, they're often not being able to get a change of clothes or a change of socks, so they're wet. They're living amongst massive rats. And in the early parts of the war, you're literally walking on top of dead bodies when the Canadian soldiers first arrive on the Western Front. All of those are contributing factors. It's always hard to pinpoint exactly what is the chief kind of manifesting factor, but all of those are certainly playing a role in soldiers breaking down with tuberculosis.
For sure. That I could see it being very aggravating.
Yeah.
Uh, Gordon says that his great grandfather died of TB in Orillia in 1913. He
Mhm.
wonders if there's a relationship to the plague during the war.
The plague. No, not really. Or sorry, not at all. The plague tends to exist in fleas. Rats can carry the virus that causes the plague, but they are often then typically transferred by fleas who bite the rats and then are passed along to soldiers. As much as the environmental conditions are pretty terrible on the Western Front, there's been a lot of kind of work done around sanitation and an understanding that sanitation is a really important part of keeping an army healthy. And so during the war, you actually see disease rates at large at much smaller rates than you would in previous wars. Even wars like the South African War fought in between 1899 and 1902, where the Canadians were last involved in a major war before the First World War. Comparing that experience where two-thirds of soldiers died of disease compared to the First World War, where you have less than, I think it's around 5% of soldiers dying of disease. Disease at large is just much less common and much less of a issue for fighting forces to contend with. And a big part of that is sanitation. And so the plague doesn't have much of an effect at all, especially on the Western Front.
Elaine wonders if you can discuss the other big disease in World War One, influenza. Uh,
Mm. Yeah, no, it's a great question, Elaine. That's a great question, Elaine. So the war and epidemics are intimately intertwined. They always have been throughout human history. When armies march, diseases march with them. And Spanish flu was no different at all. Now, there's a number of kind of competing theories as to exactly how Spanish flu took off and became a pandemic. I think the three competing theories are, if I'm remembering correctly, one was that it originated in China in late 1917.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly. So China, late 1917, in army barracks in Kansas in, I think it's early 18. And then the third one is in British military camps in 1916, 17. The most recent research, there's actually a very good book by a historian at Wilfrid Laurier University named Mark Humphreys, who's written a book called The Last Plague on Spanish Influenza in Canada. And he falls on the China origin for the kind of how the flu, where it originated and then eventually became a pandemic. But the war facilitated the spread of the virus very quickly. And so basically what happened was is that in I think it's 1917. Yeah, it's late 17, early 18. The British government wants to send a Chinese labor corps to the battlefields in order to assist on some of the more kind of laborious tasks of prosecuting a war effort. And so they take soldiers, or sorry, individuals from China, and they ship them across the world through Canada onto the Western Front. And so a lot of these Chinese laborers are the ones that are carrying the disease with them and then arriving on the Western Front and seeding the disease amongst soldiers fighting on the Western Front and also in England. And then from there, wounded soldiers are then coming back home and they are seeding the disease further. And that's where the first wave comes from. There's an argument that the disease mutated, which led to the most deadly second wave. That one, there's a little bit less confidence of where exactly that mutation took place. Maybe it was in the States, maybe it was in Great Britain, but nonetheless, this process of soldiers either training or being shipped from the battlefields back to North America, and then North American soldiers similarly being shipped back to Europe, seeded the disease all across the world. Finally, you have the Siberian Expeditionary Force in Canada, which was commissioned in 1918. Soldiers served or enlisted with the Siberian Expeditionary Force and they were sent to Vancouver. Many of those soldiers were already ill with Spanish flu. And so again, seeded specifically in Canada, the second wave, which was the deadliest of all. Yeah, war and Spanish flu, you cannot disconnect the two. They are intimately intertwined. It's a great question.
Kathy says, fantastic research. I enjoyed the joining of the soldier's experience, the emerging science, and the politics of it all. The activism that set the stage for our current system is new to me and really worth understanding. Thank you, she says. Not really a question there, but definitely kudos to you on your presentation. And I
Thank you
agree.
very much.
And Ward says that she agrees if your immune system's down, the TB infection may take the opportunity to become TB disease.
Yes.
Graham wants to know, to what degree did the influenza pandemic overshadow the tuberculosis crisis in immediate post-war Canada and in popular memory today?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one because there's very much a distinction between myth and history in this for this particular question. And I say that because we've gone through COVID-19, there was an insistence very early on in the pandemic to try to find relevant historical examples to compare COVID to. And the easiest one for us to do that was Spanish flu. And I remember seeing on social media folks, even within the history community, that they know history, but they may not necessarily know much about the Spanish flu itself. We're saying like this should lead to us re-examining how Spanish flu might have led to post-war cultural, how much the flu has been overshadowed by the war, and how we need to know how much of a legacy the flu left on Canada. But the thing is that the flu was very quickly forgotten in the aftermath of the First World War. Many historians have not necessarily written about why, but in the immediate aftermath of the war, there was a need amongst Canadians to make the war have meaning. They needed to craft a very positive and polished memory of the war to make the deaths that had taken place and the wounding that had taken place worth it. And so they set about building memorials. Obviously, a lot of us probably went to a Remembrance Day ceremony last week at one of those cenotaphs that were built in the aftermath of the First World War. And so people were very focused again on creating this polished memory. Flu, on the other hand, doesn't fit so well in that polished memory because at the time it was actually not viewed as a virus. They thought that what caused flu is a bacteria. But the bacteria, it's not really an enemy. It's an invisible agent. And it's not something that you can really easily rally behind during this time. And so as a result, the need to memorialize the First World War very much overshadowed much kind of thinking and memorializing flu at all. And it's also important to remember that flu it was horrendous in how quickly it killed so many people in Canada. But flu is also, it's just like another disease. There's still common seasonal flu out there that's happening before the war. People die of flu all the time. Again, it's not this kind of massive event where so many young people are dying, but again, it's a fairly common and normal way of dying for many people. And so again, this kind of lack of novelty of dying from flu meant that it just got subsumed under many of the other deaths related to infectious diseases at this time. The memorialization really just took over. I say all of that to say that tuberculosis actually was a much more feared disease and one that commanded attention by the state and by larger Canadian society before the war, during the war, and after the war. If anything, tuberculosis actually overshadowed flu. Some epidemiologists and some anthropologists have done some really interesting research on the relationship between tuberculosis and flu. And many of them actually argued that flu would have killed many of those that either had inactive tuberculosis or a latent tuberculosis infection, or were already suffering from active tuberculosis. And so many of the deaths would have been of people who already had tuberculosis. And so the kind of population of people actually suffering from tuberculosis, at least according to some of these anthropologists and epidemiologists, the number of the population of Canada who had tuberculosis significantly decreased after the First World War. May have contributed to death rates were already going down, mortality rates from TB were already going down, but some have argued that decline was even steeper because so many people died from Spanish flu that were, already infected with TB. So a really good question, though.
Susan wants to know, how exactly do we reach Veterans Affairs to access the pension records for the First World War?
Yeah, if it's okay with you, Amanda, I'll share the link with you for where folks can go.
That would be
It's easier than me searching around my computer right now and taking away from the question periods. I'll share that with you, Amanda, and you can share it to the folks. Share it with the folks in the other.
I'll share that into our Facebook group, and I'll also, once we get the presentation posted on our YouTube channel, I'll have the link there as well.
Yeah.
Says excellent information and presentation. Thank you. Edward and Ev have both asked, can you repeat the name of the author and the book title dealing with the Spanish flu?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I'll actually put it in the chat myself so folks know. But his name is Mark Humphreys, and the book is called The Last Plague. The Last Plague, Spanish Influenza, and the Politics of Public Health. All right. Everyone should have got that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Terry wants to know, when is your book coming out?
I've taken a little bit of a break from working on this until the new year, and then I'll be turning my current project into a fully formed book. So probably not for a couple more years. So you'll have to wait. I hope the presentation will have to do.
Yeah, pass that along. We'd love to have you back again. Absolutely, when the book is out. And I'd love to everybody here who has been listening today. Thank you again for. Sorry.
It's okay. I actually have a direct message question from Lana that maybe I'll answer if that's okay, Amanda.
Go ahead.
Okay, so she's asking about bone tuberculosis specifically. Bone tuberculosis, it was quite uncommon. It wasn't typical amongst the ways in which tuberculosis disease could manifest. I wish I should know this, but I don't know exactly how the bacteria ends up in the bones. I know that tuberculosis can end up in the blood, which is often the most kind of deadly form of tuberculosis. It's called miliary tuberculosis. But tuberculosis of the bone tends to be more common actually amongst children. And the disease often manifests in similar ways to children who have polio, in terms of deforming bones and leaving hunched backs and deformed spines and misaligned legs and bones in the limbs. Yeah, that's how bone tuberculosis manifests in terms of its actual physical symptomology. But I wish I could tell you more about the internal machinations that lead to bone tuberculosis. So I apologize, Lana, for not having that specific info for you.
All right. I think unless you have any other questions, I don't see any more questions other than I've just gotten another. It was a great presentation. Thank you very much. And oh, of course, one more question. Yep, another fabulous presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm assuming those will start rolling in now because it was absolutely a fantastic presentation. As I said to you when we got on the call initially today, I've been looking forward to this presentation since April. I was very pleased that you were willing to come on and speak with us for our Remembrance Day presentation. So thank you very much, Eric, for joining us. It definitely was a very informational presentation. We do appreciate having you here. And like I said, we'd love to have you back. So keep my email and let me know when your book is ready and we'll get you on.
Thanks a lot, Amanda, for inviting me. And thanks for all the folks tuning in again on a Friday evening when I'm sure you have lots of other things going on in your lives. So it's always a ton of fun to speak about this stuff, but thanks again for tuning in.
Perfect. And then just a few bookends. A reminder again to keep your ears open for our upcoming presentations in January and February with Nadia on World War II and Graham Seger from the Pelham Historical Society on Tremaines maps. I'll remind you again that it's always membership season. We appreciate your support, but we'd love to have you support Niagara Branch specifically. If you're a member of the Ontario Genealogical Society, make sure that you make the extra check mark and donate the extra $5 so that you can get access to our special Niagara specific resources. We can help you break through any genealogical brick walls you might have with relation to your Niagara relatives. We love to support your projects to help preserve Niagara heritage. If you have a speaker or you are a speaker, by all means, give us a contact and we'd love to have you speak to our membership. And you also support us in our ability to continue these wonderful webinars. And a reminder now that our master index is now on ancestry.com. So you may find our records for Niagara people on ancestry.com, and then you can reach out to us or have a look online to find those for us on our site, which is niagara.ogs.on.ca. And on that site at the bottom of the page, you can join up for our monthly newsletter if you haven't joined already. It's the best way to keep tabs on our new resources, current research, and our upcoming webinars and regional events. Thank you again, Eric, for joining us. I will get that link out to you as soon as Eric gets it to me. If you missed anything, the presentation will be on YouTube at some point in the not too distant future. So keep a watch for it there. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.
Take care, everybody.